Chapter 23 of 20 Minutes Late by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Another Sidetrack. Ben's brief holiday sped away. He and Rufus and Fanny went home, school duties commenced again, and all things were as before. No, not quite as before. Rufus and Fanny had learned some lessons of life which they were not likely to forget. They had discovered that a girl could be honestly earning her own living, and yet be as highly thought of by those whose opinion was worth having as though she were doing nothing. Ben had his beloved stenograph, and worked at every leisure moment with such purpose that before spring he had a triumph. At the office one afternoon he found Mr. Welborn very much annoyed. "I don't know what I'm going to do," said that gentleman impatiently. "Here's Harris sent word that he is sick and cannot copy these notes of his, and there isn't a person in town, so far as I know, who can do it for him." Mr. Welborn was not talking to Ben, but to his junior partner. But Ben had turned at the first sound of Mr. Harris's name, giving a keen glance at the notes to be copied. As he suspected, they were stenograph notes. As soon as he had finished distributing the letters which he had in his hand into their proper places, he came toward Mr. Welborn. "I beg your pardon," he said hesitatingly, "but if there isn't anybody else, I think I could copy those notes for you." "You?" said Mr. Welborn with a smile. "I know you are a most accommodating chap, but I'm afraid these notes will be too much for you. They are on a shorthand machine." "I know it," said Ben. "I have seen Mr. Harris work. I can read the stenograph." "You can? How long since? Where did you learn?" "I learned early in the winter. My sister, who is in Philadelphia, sent me the alphabet and the manual, and I learned how to read it before I ever saw a machine. Then at Christmas time I had a present of one, and have been writing on it ever since." "The mischief! You have? And I never knew anything about it. Can you take down letters at dictation?" "I think I can, sir. Mother has dictated a great many to me for practice, and I have written them out afterwards, and got every word." "Glad to hear it," said Mr. Welborn complacently. "Harris is sick oftener than I have any patience with. The trouble is, he is sick of the business and wants to get out. Do set to work on these notes then. They are important ones, and if you can make a fair copy, and can take dictations, I can afford to give you pleasanter employment and better pay than I have been doing." A boy does not work industriously on a stenograph for 3 months for nothing. The notes were almost as easily read by Ben as though they had been in print. By 9 o'clock that evening he was able to give an excellent typewritten copy of them to the gratified lawyer. From that time business was brisk for Ben Bryant, and the work was such as delighted his heart, and in itself was no small education, for Mr. Welborn's notes were dictated in choice English, and were on important subjects. He made a prompt advance in Ben's wages, such a surprising advance as caused great rejoicing at home, and some grumbling on the part of Rufus in regard to "people who are always in luck." With Caroline the time sped away on swift wings. So busy was she with her studies, and with her loving care of Dorothy, so happy and proud was she with Mrs. Forsythe's increasing interest in her and pleasure in her ministrations, so glad was she, as the weeks flew on, over the near prospect of home once more, that she was the only one in the household, perhaps, who did not realize Dr. Forsythe's increasing gravity, and notice the tender, almost pathetic gaze which he sometimes fixed on Dorothy's fair face. It did trouble Caroline sometimes to think that Dorothy seemed not so strong as she was in the fall. "But it is the spring days," she said to herself. "Nobody feels as strong, I suppose. At least, nobody who is not real well. I am sure I feel as strong as ever I did in my life, but of course Dorothy could not be expected to." April passed swiftly, and May followed in its train, and the days of June were speeding so fast that examinations were just at the door, and Caroline had had her trunk brought from the storeroom and was beginning to put in packages preparatory to the home going. "Just to think," she had begun to say to herself, "that I shall really see Mother and Ben and Daisy in a few days more." Then, one evening after school, Dr. Forsythe called her as she was passing his office door. He was alone, and as he closed the door and sat down in front of the seat to which he had motioned her, his kind face was graver than usual. "I have something to say to you, Caroline, which I have been putting off for several days, weeks indeed, because I feared you might not like to hear it." Caroline, startled, wondering, yet managed to say that she should hardly think it possible that Dr. Forsythe could say anything that she did not like. He smiled in reply, a grave, sad smile, and then spoke hurriedly. "You cannot in the nature of things be expected to like it, and I have been in a great doubt whether to speak it or not, but I have finally resolved to make the effort. I will not keep you in suspense. The plain, sad truth is, Caroline, that our little daughter is failing. We cannot have her with us long. It is increasingly apparent to me every day. You know we are planning for the seaside, and hope something from the sea air, but not very much after all, so far as she is concerned. Can you guess what I am about to say? Can you imagine how her father and mother shrink from separating her from the young friend who has been so constantly with her during this long winter, and been to her such a comfort and help? Neither she nor we can ever forget. If you could find it in your heart, Caroline, to give up home and mother, and go to the seashore with us, I do not say it would prolong our daughter's life, but I cannot help seeing that it would make the days she spends with us brighter, happier. At the same time, I know it is a great thing to ask. I know what it must have been to you to have been so long away from your mother. I know, better than you may imagine I do, the sacrifice it is to give up mother. I do not ask it of you. Mrs. Forsythe does not. Glad as she would be to give Dorothy this additional pleasure, she shrank from the thought of making the request. I have not written to your mother, of course. It is only very lately that I decided to speak at all, and I will not now say anything to her until you have come to a decision. We must go next week. It ought to have been sooner, but Dorothy's heart is so set upon being present at the closing exercises of the public school that I do not like to disappoint her. I leave the matter with you to think about. Remember, we realize how much we ask, and we shall not feel that you have done wrong, indeed, will not feel hurt at all, if you decide that you cannot really give up mother and home this summer and go with us. Try to think as quickly as you can, and let me hear tomorrow, if possible, what your impressions are." He hurried through the last sentence because somebody was already tapping at the door. With a bow and smile to Caroline, he answered the summons. Poor Caroline need not have waited until the next day to give her answer. She knew before he had completed his sentence what she must decide to do. It made her heart almost stop beating to think of being all the long summer without seeing mother, but at the same instant came the terror of the thought, what if she should never see Dorothy again? Could it be possible that her father thought that she would not live longer than this one summer? Perhaps it was not strange that the first thing this girl far away from home did, when she reached her room, was to lock the door, throw herself on the bed, bury her head in the pillows, and burst into a perfect passion of tears. It seemed to her that from any point of view there was enough to cry for. It was nearly an hour afterwards that she stood brushing her hair before the mirror, having bathed her eyes with the hottest water she could endure. In a few minutes the dinner bell would ring, and she must go down and meet them all, and they would know that she had been crying, and Dr. Forsythe would know the reason. She was sorry for that. She would not trust herself to talk to him, but had resolved to write him a little note that very night. "There is no use in waiting," she said aloud, to see how the words would sound. I am not to go home, I know I am not. It is the right way to do, mother will think, and so will Ben, and even poor little Daisy. After all they have done for me, and after the way Dorothy loves me, it would be just cruel not to give her what she wants. I know mother will think I ought to stay with her all summer. I may just as well write the note to-night as to wait until to-morrow morning, because I am sure what it is right to do." Therefore the note was written in Caroline's best hand, very brief and to the point. "Dear Dr. Forsythe, I will go with Dorothy if my mother thinks best, and I am almost sure she will. I will write to her to-night. And please do not think it makes me feel very badly. I love Dorothy so much that it would be hard to be away from her." Matters shaped themselves exactly as Caroline had expected they would. The letter home was written, and the Bryant family held a solemn convention over its contents. None of them was as much excited and startled as they had been over their disappointment in the fall. After the second reading of the letter, they all sat quiet for some minutes. Then Mrs. Bryant said inquiringly, with a sad little smile, "Well, children?" "Well," said Ben, heaving a long-drawn sigh, "I suppose it's the right thing to do, mother, isn't it? That poor little Dorothy!" "What does our Daisy say?" asked Mrs. Bryant tenderly. Daisy's face was grave. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and her eyes had a far-away, sorrowful look. "Mother," she said at last, her lips quivering, but her voice low and composed, "I love my Line, and I want her very much. But if that little Dorothy is going to heaven pretty soon, she ought to have Line, I think, this summer. Perhaps she needs her to help her get ready." So the question was settled, and Caroline's trunk, instead of being packed for home, was packed for the seaside with all sorts of new and dainty summer things, such as she was sure would have driven Fanny Kedwin half frantic with envy. And one summer day she took that long-planned journey on the cars. Not a very long journey, for the sea-coast which Dr. Forsythe chose was but a few hours' ride from Philadelphia, but long enough for Caroline to realize the sharp contrast between herself as a traveler now and 8 months before. In the first place, it was a very different car which they occupied, a drawing-room car, Dorothy called it, with easy chairs and sofas, and a private room at one end where a luxurious bed was made up for Mrs. Forsythe. It is not my intention to tell you much about that summer at the seaside. It was a very full, bright summer, and despite the shadow which hung low over the household, there were some sweet, glad days. Dorothy rallied a little under the influence of the sea breeze, and took what were for her long walks to the beach, and liked nothing better than to sit in the sand with Caroline beside her, watchful over the wraps and the sun umbrella that it was at exactly the right angle to shade her from the sun's glare, and watch the bathers as they rose gaily over the tops of the waves, or the never-ceasing tide as it came rolling in. At intervals Caroline left her and wandered along the beach to bring beautiful shells and delicate stones, pearly tinted, blue and amber. Long, quiet, restful days they were, when Dorothy seemed at peace with all the world, the only trouble she had being the one which she often put into words. "I am so sorry, Caroline dear, that you have to be away from your mother and Daisy and Ben all summer. But you will go to them in the fall, and have a nice, long vacation." This was the utmost Caroline ever allowed her to say about the sacrifice, and was quick to assure her with kisses and caresses that she was having a lovely time, that she had never seen the sea before, and had always wanted to, and that she wouldn't be away from her dear little Dorothy these summer days for anything, and that mother and Daisy and Ben felt so too. Then Dorothy would smile her sweet, fair smile, and say gently, "You are all good to me. Everybody always was. It is a very sweet world, Caroline, and sometimes I try to think how heaven can be any sweeter. If Jesus were not there, it could not be. But the best of it is, he is there, isn't he? Caroline, do you sometimes feel in a hurry to see him?" Caroline, awe-stricken, could only confess that she never had felt that way. She supposed it was because she was always well, and never had a tired feeling. Then she would bring a new shell or a stone, and try to turn Dorothy's thoughts away from the grave subject. So the days moved on. "I think she is better," said Caroline one evening, in answer to Dr. Forsythe's quick, questioning look. It was Saturday evening, and he had come up from the city to spend a Sabbath with his family. Caroline, according to her custom, had gone to the station to meet him, in order that he might have the earliest possible news of Dorothy. "I really think, Dr. Forsythe, that she is stronger than she was. Her appetite has been better, and she looks more like herself for a few days than she has since we have been here. But she has been in a great hurry to see you. She has asked 2 or 3 times today if we felt pretty sure that nothing would hinder you from coming." "I had hard work to get away," he said gravely, "but I felt impressed that I must come tonight." "Dr. Forsythe," said Caroline earnestly, as they walked up the street together, "don't you think, perhaps, now that the very warm weather is over, and the pleasant September days are coming, that Dorothy may grow stronger and be real well again this winter?" Dr. Forsythe smiled, that tender, grave smile which she had learned to know so well. "We never can be sure," he said quietly. "With a disease like hers, we never can be sure just when the end will come. But I have seen nothing this summer to encourage me thus far." It was a very quiet Sabbath. Dr. Forsythe did not go to church, as had been his custom every Sabbath during the season, but had stayed with his wife and Dorothy, sending Caroline and the grandmother away by themselves. It was noticeable that Dorothy talked to her father this time even more than usual, and seemed not to be quite happy when he was out of her sight. Yet the day passed very peacefully, and on Monday morning Dorothy certainly seemed, as Caroline had said, stronger than she had for weeks. "I believe the child is getting better," said the grandmother with decision. "Her face is less pallid than it was, and this morning she really has a little color. I felt sure the seaside would do her good. Can't you see she is improved, doctor? You are always so despondent, so inclined to look on the dark side." The doctor smiled. "Am I?" he said. "I have need to find a bright side, if there is one, surely. She is all we have, mother." To Dorothy's eager question as to whether her father might take the early train, and whether he was sure that he could plan to come down on Saturday just a little earlier than usual, so that they might have a visit together on the beach before sunset, he answered, with a smile that he tried to make bright and cheery, "We needn't discuss those points today, Dorothy. I'm going to take a vacation and stay over. I arranged with Dr. Boydner to look after my patients, and assured him that for the one working day of the 365 I was to be at leisure and give myself to the delights of my family. Dorothy, I have brought with me a new toy that I think you will enjoy. It was brought up from the station Saturday evening after you and Caroline had retired, and it is in my private room all ready for exhibition. Come to me as soon as you have had your breakfast, and I promise you a delightful entertainment." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of 20 Minutes Late by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. At Last. The "new toy" was nothing more nor less than a phonograph, a machine in which Dr. Forsythe had been deeply interested for some time, and whose mechanical workings he had studied with great care. He now took the deepest interest in explaining in detail, both to Dorothy and Caroline, the practical working of this wonderful little instrument, then unlocked its gate, put in a cylinder, turned on the power, and called upon Dorothy to talk to it. "What shall I say, papa?" she asked, a pretty pink flush of excitement on her fair cheek. Say anything you please, daughter. Speak in your natural tone of voice, just as though you were talking to me, and use any words you please. You can talk to Mamma if you choose, or to Grandmother or Caroline. It will take down every word you utter." Sure enough it did, and was an object of absorbing interest to Dorothy all the morning. Cylinder after cylinder was placed at intervals during the day, and she was permitted to talk to them, to sing in her sweet, clear voice one of her favorite hymns, to recite a poem of which both she and her mother were especially fond, and to say all manner of loving words. It was noticeable that Dr. Forsythe, though he had explained the economy of the invention by showing them how to pare a cylinder after it had once been used and copied, so that it might be used again and again, even to the number of 70 times or more, would carefully set away in a box on an upper shelf every one to which Dorothy had spoken, with directions that they on no account be disturbed. To the astonishment and delight of his daughter, Dr. Forsythe announced the next morning that he intended to take another play day. "I feel a year or 2 younger on account of this one," he said smilingly, "and I have telegraphed Dr. Boydner that he need not expect me today. He said I would become so fascinated with the phonograph that I wouldn't be able to tear myself away, so he will understand at least one of my reasons." Another long, bright day, full of interest and satisfaction to Dorothy, was spent by the little family of which Caroline seemed to herself to have become a part. Mrs. Forsythe, whom the sea breezes had really improved, was able to rest on the couch in the doctor's room and enjoy with them the talking machine, as Dorothy had named it, which did not in the least lose its charm. Later in the day, after the mother had been carried in her husband's strong arms to her own room for a rest, Dorothy and Caroline were alone together. Dorothy had been lying back among the pillows, resting also. Suddenly she roused herself and looked toward the phonograph. "Caroline, put a cylinder in the talking machine, please. I want to talk a letter to Papa and Mamma. I know why Papa doesn't want any of those up on the shelf pared. He wants to keep his little Dorothy's voice to talk to him next winter. Isn't it nice that he can? Now I will talk a letter to him and Mamma that they will not know anything about until some day you will tell them, and it will please them very much." Caroline had no words to answer. Silently she fitted the cylinder into the machine, pushed up the chair for Dorothy, arranged the pillow at her back, turned on the power, and stood waiting to see what she was to do next. "Now," said Dorothy, smiling up at her, "would you just please to go to the other room and leave me all alone a little while? I want to talk some words to Papa and Mamma, just for them, you know. They are good-bye words, Caroline, that I don't know how to say to them, because it makes them feel badly. But some day they will like to put the cylinder in this machine, and hear it say the words in my own voice." Tears were choking Caroline's voice so that she could not answer, except by kisses, which she left on the 2 fair cheeks as she moved softly away. She waited at the door outside for Dorothy's call, and presently it came. "I've finished it," said Dorothy, in a tone of intense satisfaction. "A nice, long talk. Put it away, Caroline, on the very top shelf, and put a little slip of paper inside, marked, 'Dorothy's talk to Papa and Mamma.' I've said some sweet good-bye words to them. It is very nice. I am so glad Papa brought the phonograph down to me so that I could talk to it for them. I meant to write a little letter, but this is a great deal nicer, isn't it, Caroline? Because they can hear my voice say the words. Now let us go to Mamma's room and see the sunset. There will be a lovely sunset tonight, I think. Those clouds over there are beginning to reflect it already." In a few moments more she was cozily settled on a couch in her mother's room, her head resting on the pillow beside her mother's, one hand clasped in her father's, and her face turned toward the glowing west. It was a wonderful sunset, unlike any which Caroline had ever remembered before. They talked about it for a few minutes, called one another's attention to the lovely gold, the glowing crimson, with its background of violet shading into even darker hues, and the clouds took strange shapes like castles and towers burnished with gold. "There's a door," said Dorothy suddenly, her eyes fixed on the glory. "The door of heaven, and it is wide open. It looks as though there were angels standing in the door beckoning. Do you see them, Papa? Look, Mamma, look, Caroline. Angels and angels, ever so many of them, right in the door and all about it. Ah, there, they have gone, and the door is shut." She was still again. They were all very still. A strange hush seemed to have fallen upon them, broken first by the sound of a stifled sob, for grandmother was crying. A moment more and Dr. Forsythe arose, turned on the gas which had been but a faint glimmer, and bent over Dorothy. She lay just as she had when the twilight began, face close to her mother's on the pillow, one hand clasped in hers. But Dr. Forsythe, bending low till his lips touched hers, said tremulously, "Our darling has gone in, and the door is shut." There was a sad journey back to Philadelphia, carrying with them the precious body whose soul went home in that twilight, when to her the doors of heaven seemed to open, and the angels came to meet her. Those had been sad, anxious days which followed. Mrs. Forsythe, shocked by the blow, with which all her preparation had at last come suddenly, for a few days sank rapidly, and it seemed for a time as though she too was going away. But she rallied, and tried bravely to take nourishing food, and to sleep and rest, and not wear out her heart with weeping. "I must not go yet," she said to Caroline, with a faint smile. "It would be too hard for the doctor. He cannot spare Dorothy and me both at once. Dorothy would want me to stay and comfort him. I must try to grow strong." Once during those trying days had Dr. Forsythe paused in his busy, anxious life to lay a kind hand on Caroline's shoulder and say earnestly, "Child, you are a comfort to us. I hardly see how we could have gone without you. It will be a blessed memory to us always that you were with our little girl to the last moment. Went to the very door with her. We can never forget it, Caroline. You have a blessed mother, I know, and no one must step in and take her place. But next to her, my child, think of Dorothy's father and mother as your own. You will always be to us a dear older daughter. For your own sake, as well as for the sake of the one you loved, we shall delight to plan for you as if you were indeed our very own." Mrs. Forsythe said it differently. Caroline was one evening arranging the pillows, just as some way she had a talent for doing, and Dorothy's mother reached up, put a fair arm around her neck, drew her head close down to the pillow, and said, "Dear little girl, Dorothy's Caroline and my Caroline. Love us for her sake, won't you? You must go home very soon. That is right, of course. It is hard to have kept you so long. But when you have had a good long rest and visit, come back to us, dear. Think of your school duties and home life with us. Pet me instead of Dorothy, dear. I need it. We cannot try to get along without you, and I am glad there is no need, for you should be in school, and there are no better ones than we can offer you." At last the morning came, and the hour and the moment when Caroline Bryant was actually seated in the Philadelphia train on her way home, whirling over the road which she had traveled, a desolate little girl, so many months before. How different everything looked to her! How utterly different everything was! She thought of that forlorn little girl in a torn, soiled dress that had done duty all day in the woods, in a pair of heavy shoes much the worse for wear, gloveless, and without wraps or baggage of any sort. What a different picture was the trim maiden who occupied a seat in the parlor car, clothed from head to foot in the most becoming and appropriate of traveling costumes, hat and gloves and all her belongings matching exquisitely, and at her side a modern traveling bag carefully stocked with every convenience that a young traveler could possibly need. Conductor Brinker made many stops at her seat. opened her window for her or closed it, drew down the shade or put it up as occasion suggested, and did everything he could think of for her comfort. But there was a respectful air about it all, an air of deference such as he showed to ladies. He even called her Miss when he brought her some bright flowers which she had caught sight of by the roadside and admired. Caroline smiled and answered promptly, "I am just Caroline, Mr. Brinker. Don't call me anything else. Here is a paper of bonbons which I wish you would take to Daisy and Bubby. I was going around to say goodbye and leave them, but I hadn't time, so I thought I would bring them along and give them to you." Great was Conductor Brinker's pleasure at this. Bubby would be tickled to death, he declared. He remembered her, of course he did. He talked about her for days after the last time she was there. And Daisy was very well, getting to be a right good smart girl, her father said. Goes to school regular as clockwork, means to grow up a smart lady like her Caroline. And he smiled broadly. As the day wore away, and the train neared the familiar station which meant home and mother and Ben and little Daisy to this homesick heart, Caroline had much to do to maintain her dignity. She felt at times as though she must tell all the passengers her story. How she had gone to Philadelphia, ever and ever so long ago, without any intention on her part, and stayed without any expectation of doing so, and been sidetracked a great many times when she was about to start for home, but now she was really and truly within 3 miles of home. However, she did nothing of the kind, but sat erect, with her cheeks growing pinker and pinker, and looked steadily out of the window. They passed the junction, which had caused her so much trouble, without so much as a halt. The sun was set, and the street lamps were being lighted as they rolled into the station. At last she was home. Outside were Mother and Ben and Daisy, and Mr. Holden and Mrs. Kedwin, and Fanny and Rufus. She could see them, every one, even before the train stopped. She tapped on the window and fluttered her handkerchief, and Ben caught a glimpse of it. Before she could make her way to the platform, he was beside her. What a homecoming was that! "My darling!" said Mrs. Bryant, folding both her arms about her, and giving her such a long, long kiss that Daisy felt as though her turn were never coming. "My darling, we have you indeed." "Why, Line Bryant," said Fanny Kedwin, "how you are rigged up! Dear me, I should think you were going to a party." But Caroline was being smothered in Daisy's arms, hearing her soft, tremulous voice murmur, "My Line," and had no ears for Fanny Kedwin. They came over that evening, Fanny and Rufus, with their mother. "The children had to come," said Mrs. Kedwin. "I told them they ought to stay away one night and give you a chance to visit with your folks, but they were that crazy to see you that they couldn't give it up. My sakes, Line, but you have grown into a fine lady, sure enough. Fine feathers make fine birds, that's a fact. They have got good taste, I'll say that for them, and you are a pretty girl anyhow. Clothes look well on you." Caroline laughed and blushed, while Ben gravely gave it as his opinion that clothes looked pretty well on most people. "Are you going back there?" asked Fanny a little later, as Caroline obliged herself to go away from her mother's side and sit down by the young folks for a little talk. "Say, Line, Ben says you are going back there. Are you?" "Yes," said Caroline. "I am going back to school. The schools are splendid there, you know, and I am to go through, complete my education and graduate if I want to." "Oh, my sakes!" said Fanny. "What luck!" "I think as much," said Rufus. "Say, you folks, do you know that it is exactly a year ago today that we went nutting?" "That's a fact," said Ben, considering for a moment. "Line, it took you a whole year to get home from a nutting excursion. Just think of it." "And only think of all the things that have happened since," said Rufus. "I tell you what it is, Line Bryant, I am the one to be thanked for all your feathers, ruffles, and watches, and I don't know what not. If it hadn't been for me going off that night, leaving you asleep and all that, it wouldn't any of it ever have happened. I never thought of that before. All the good luck you have had this year has come through me." "You were never willing to take the blame before," said Ben, laughing. "If you hadn't put her on the wrong train, the going to sleep wouldn't have done any harm. But never mind, it's all over now. She's got back, if it has taken her a long time to do it." Caroline's smile came through a mist of tears. She could not talk so glibly of all that had happened as they could. The year had been full of blessing to her, and it seemed to her that she could never be grateful enough for having known and loved her Dorothy, but the pain of parting from her and of doing without her was too recent for her to be able to laugh and talk cheerily of all the happenings of that year. "I suppose they gave you lots of things?" said Fanny, not being able to get away from the practical part of the matter. "Is that your best dress you traveled in? Oh, my sakes, a nicer one than that? Well, they spent lots of money on you, that's a fact." Caroline was silent and half indignant. How rude and unrefined and almost coarse this old friend of hers had grown. The year seemed not to have changed her in the least for the better. She had had in mind to tell them about the beautiful soft white dresses, and blue dresses, and wraps and hats, which, with loving thoughtfulness, Mrs. Forsythe had sent to Daisy. "They are all my Dorothy's things," she had said when she took the key of the large trunk from under her pillow and handed it to Caroline. "They will just fit your Daisy. I cannot have them lie and grow yellow and creased and moth-eaten perhaps, because my darling has gone to heaven and will need them no more. I would a great deal rather Daisy had them. Besides, she wanted it so. She sent them to Daisy herself. That was one of the messages in her letter, Caroline." Caroline had thought to tell about the letter given to the talking machine, and to describe some of the pretty things in the trunk, and tell them how sweet Dorothy had looked in them, but Fanny's sordid views and disagreeable ways of talking closed her lips. She felt sure that they would not understand. "You are great folks for luck," said Rufus with a sigh. "I always said so, and if this year doesn't prove it, I don't know what does. To think that because that train was 20 minutes late, all this should have happened." End of Chapter 24. End of 20 Minutes Late by Pansy. Recording by TriciaG. Thanks for listening.